My name is Ray Smock. I'm the director of the Robert C. Byrd Center, and I welcome you all to the center. This is the second time that the Society for History and the Federal Government has been out here, and I hope you'll come back whenever you feel like you want to get outside the Beltway for one of your meetings. So we're always delighted to have you. And as a past president, I feel that any time that this facility can be used for any purposes of the society, it's yours. So, but not my salary. To begin with, I would like to introduce my staff because they will be facilitating and helping you in any way that they can during the 2 days of the meeting. And and they're all seated back over there. And that's Mark Levitt, the archivist at the Byrd Center. Jody Grummage is there, and Jay Wyatt. Where's Jay? Oh, there's Jay Wyatt. And we also have our student interns who work in the archives who are here to help us tonight. And we have Sarah Brennan and Mallory Matos. They're wearing these little staff buttons, these little gold things. If you need any help, they'll be glad to help you. Casey DeHaven and Dylan Rosenleib. So those are our student interns, and we always use students here at the Byrd Center whenever we can to help us with our work and also to introduce them to public history. Tomorrow at around 12:30, we will have archival tours with that Jody and Mark will lead, so you can see the Byrd Center archive and some of our holdings, and we have some little exhibits set out, including one document where a Korean back in the 70s offered Senator Byrd a $100,000 donation right on the spot. Turned out to be a fraud, but that was during the Koreagate scandal. Luckily, we also have documents that show that Senator Byrd immediately notified the FEC and wrote the guy back and told him what he could do with his money, put it that way. There's also copies of Senator Byrd's book available to any of you who would like one. It's called Losing America, which still holds up as a pretty good critique of not only the Bush administration, but of what Senator Byrd saw wrong with the Senate, including his own party. And it has a nice collection of some of his better known speeches, especially those about the Iraq War, including the famous speech, the Senate, here we stand mute, the Senate stands mute, and not even debating this war. Those are out there in the lobby, and you're welcome to pick them up. If the supply gets low, ask any of my staff, and they will find some more for you. We got a ton of them. So, I think that's all of my remarks. I hope you have a great meeting, and I want to say that if there's anything that we can do for you along the way, please, to make it a better meeting, please let us know. And I'm going to now turn it over to President David Mcmillan, who will introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you all for being here. And thank you especially to the Byrd Center and staff and interns for their hospitality. It is going to be a great weekend. Carl and his colleagues, with your help, have put together a remarkable program, and I look forward to sharing it with you this weekend. It is, however, tonight my honor and privilege to introduce the winner of the Trask Award, Charlene Bangs-Bigford. We are truly fortunate to have her amongst our ranks. Charlene is the director of the First Federal Congress Project at the George Washington University, and one of the editors of the 22-volume documentary history of the First Federal Congress, 1789 to 1791. The history is nearing completion. It took more years than the Congress, but that's not unusual. She's taught undergraduate and graduate courses for both George Washington and George Mason universities, lectured at Mount Vernon, the Newberry Library, Montpelier, and numerous other institutions. Charlene is a past president of the Society for History of the Federal Government and a past president of the Association of Documentary Editing. But One of her most important contributions has been in the early 80s. She led the movement to form the Coalition to Save Our Documentary Heritage. They fought against zeroing out the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, a fight that goes on to this day. They advocated for the independence of the National Archives, a fight that also lasted some 20-some years, started in the mid-60s, around 1964, and wasn't won until 1985. And her advocacy efforts continue on behalf of the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, the National Archives, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Charlene Bangs-Bigford.
Thank you, everyone. I first want to note that outside on the table there are quite a few documents, copies of documents, not real documents, from the collections of the National Archives that were part of the exhibits at a session earlier this week, 2 days ago, that was celebrating the 225th anniversary of the Senate. Afterwards, I'll be glad to talk with people about those documents, and Jesse could probably do it too, and others here. And also, there's a letter there that we actually got from a place called the Strawberry Bank Museum in New Hampshire. And it's a letter from Samuel Otis to John Langdon that I'll talk about later. I wanted to begin by saying that I'm quite sure that there are others in this organization that have made greater contributions to both the study of federal history and to history in the federal government. But it really is a great honor for me to receive this award from the SHFG. I consider this society, which has played a critically important role in promoting the study of federal history and providing ways for those engaged in the study of history, federal history, to meet, share information, and communicate, to be one of my professional homes. Though I haven't been employed by the federal government agency since a very brief period working for the National Archives in 1967. That was a long time ago. My life's professional work has focused upon the federal government. Its early years, 2 of those years. And since the 1979 founding of the Ad Hoc Emergency Committee to preserve the National Archives, to oppose the dispersal of collections in the National Archives to record centers across the country, I've been part of advocacy movements for NARA, NHPRC, and the NEH, and a few other causes of professional interest to federal historians and archivists. I know that some of those in attendance this evening, including my longtime colleague, ally, and friend, our host, Ray Smock, still have fond memories of those meetings of the Emergency Committee to preserve the National Archives in Pete Daniels' Capitol Hill living room. We were planning strategy and calculating ways to get the big guns in the history profession on record against dispersal of the records. That particular advocacy effort took place soon after the founding of 2 organizations that have often provided key leadership on issues of federal history, archives, and publication of the essential documents of our national history for several decades now. The Society for History of the Federal Government and the Association for Documentary Editing. And come to think of it, most of the individuals present at those meetings in Pete's living room went on to become president of the SHFG. And some of us have also led the ADE. During these advocacy efforts, I found that those who understand the issues best are often individuals who work in federal history. I'm proud to have been associated with the SHFG and its members since its founding, and believe that the Society's publications and activities and the communication and cross-pollination among historians who do federal history that they promote have served a very essential purpose. Though David advised me that I could talk on any subject at all, I've decided to spare you and not to give in to the temptation to launch into a detailed, in-the-weeds discussion of the current political struggle over the new proposed NHPRC grant guidelines. Instead, I want to take you back 225 years ago this week, when the first federal Congress finally achieved a quorum and settled down to do the precedent-setting and difficult work of fleshing out the new federal government outlined in the Constitution, and addressing the difficult issues that had bedeviled the Confederation Congress. A warning should be provided here for some of you. I see people who were there when I gave a talk 2 days ago, and some of this is going to be repetitive. So if you do want to slip out and, spend a little time in the hallway, come back later, it's okay. So despite the fact that our current Congress very often, too often I think, seems more than a little dysfunctional, as historians, we still should find it quite amazing that this bicameral elected legislature has reached the milestone of 225 years, an accomplishment unparalleled in the history of democracies. Our Constitution and the governmental structure that it created has weathered crisis, adapted to change, and stood the test of time. And the United States Congress is at the heart of that enduring structure. The founders saw the legislature as the first branch of government, and its duties and powers are much more clearly and extensively defined in the Constitution than those of the other two branches. It was up to Congress to do the real work of fleshing out the government structure outlined in the Constitution and ensuring that the new federal institutions met the needs of the nation. I promise to get back to the substance of my talk with dispatch, but given this audience, I can't resist providing a little background on the First Federal Congress project and the documentary history of the First Federal Congress, or FFCP and DHFFC in our code. The edition has 3 series, 8 volumes of official records. Those include the journals, the Senate Legislative, the Senate Executive, the related documents in the Executive Journal, the House Journal, 3 volumes of legislative histories, and then 2 volumes of all the myriad petitions submitted to the first Congress, and also a section on all the rules and other procedures of the Congress. 20 volumes of the DHFFC have been published by the Johns Hopkins University Press. Volume 21 is at the press, and the final volume will be submitted this year. The project is sponsored and partially funded by the George Washington University and has received support from some of my favorite government agencies, the National Historical Publications and Records Commission and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and some private foundations, most notably the William Nelson Cromwell Foundation. We editors at the FFCP have had the amazing good fortune to work for a project launched in the era of what became known as comprehensive editions. Our mission is to locate, collect, edit, and publish, or use in some way, every surviving official or unofficial document that relates to the history of what we believe was the most important and productive Congress in United States history. I find it almost incredible that so many original documents, particularly the personal letters to and from the members, have survived and are still available in archives and manuscript collections across this country. A recent, thorough, final search using WorldCat and Archives Grid turned up over 40 letters written to or from members of the FFC that we were previously unaware of. some of them deposited in public institutions since our last final search. In recent years, we've increased our efforts to build relationships with private collectors and manuscript dealers who hold or know of a fair number of original FFC letters. Several of them have become friends of the project, most notably after we helped North Carolina recover their original of the Bill of Rights. That got a lot of notice from collectors and people who sell manuscripts. So they have been helping us try to find anything that might still be out there that we haven't found. The official records, now I'm going to skip from the First Federal Congress project, that's enough of that, and go on to the meat of this talk, talking about the records of the First Congress and what they revealed to us. First, people that work in Senate records should be so proud because the records reveal that Samuel A. Otis, the longtime Continental Congress, and like longtime Continental Congress Secretary Charles Thompson before him, seems to have preserved every single scrap of paper. And the scraps saved by those early archivists are often gems. One only needs to look at the original Senate draft of the Judiciary Act of 1789 to understand how valuable the retention of these records was to reconstructing the legislative history. For example, we can tell that a grand committee, the grand committee, the members were one from each state, appointed a subcommittee to draft the bill. How can we tell that? Because the bill has got 3 different handwritings in it. The people those days, they had to write these things out by hand. It's hard to imagine today. And also we can tell from the handwriting again that they took on different parts of the bill. One dealt with structure, one dealt with jurisdiction, and one dealt with procedures. We can tell who those people were besides. Handwriting on the draft revealed that which senators were on the subcommittee and what their topics were. If the first clerk of the House, John Beckley, who I never say very many good words about, although we probably are through more quickly than we would have been if John Beckley had been a good archivist. But Beckley's habit was to, if he had a later copy of something, I mean, we can pretty much prove this. If he had a later copy of something, he didn't need to keep the earlier copy. So with the House records, you can't document the process. You have to do what you can using printed versions, and there's this lucky happenstance that one of the original drafts of a House bill ends up in Senate records. And that really is useful, but the Senate House is where most of the legislation was started, and House records are very pathetic. Anyway, going back to the Senate, for this talk I drew on several volumes of the DHFFC, including the Senate Executive Journal and volumes covering the correspondence of that Congress's first session. Volume 9, The Diary of William Clay and Notes of Other Senators, which presents an annotated edition of one of the most important political documents in American history, is an essential resource for the First Senate, which met in secret, both as legislative and as executive sessions. You'll hear more about and from that diary later. It's because of those published volumes and a couple of volumes of the presidential series of the Papers of George Washington that I was able quite easily to pull together all the existing official and unofficial evidence for this talk. I'll use that documentary evidence to tell the stories of the rocky start of the constitutionally established advice and consent relationship between the Senate and George Washington and the precedents that were established during those early days. Currently, when the U.S. Senate is considering a potentially controversial presidential nomination for a federal office requiring its advice and consent, we'll often hear a news report that mentions the tradition of senatorial courtesy as dating back to 1789. The name that comes immediately to my mind when I hear one of these reports is Benjamin Fishbourne. Though the senators present during the executive session of August 5th, 1789, couldn't have realized its long-term importance, their rejection of President George Washington's nomination of Fishbourne to be the naval officer at Savannah, Georgia, set an enduring precedent. The story of Fishbourne's nomination and the reaction to it illustrates how the puzzle pieces of the official records and the unofficial records can be pieced together to understand this important precedent-setting moment in Senate executive relations. Although March 4, 1789 was the appointed day for the first meeting of the First Federal Congress, it wasn't until the 6th of April that Virginia's Richard Henry Lee arrived and the Senate achieved a quorum. The House had begun work 4 days earlier, and not surprisingly, their attention was quickly focused upon the imperative need to raise revenue for the operations of the federal government. Understandably, they turned first to taxing imported goods, as well as laying duties on the tonnage of ships that imported those goods. This new revenue system would need to be administered in every U.S. port through which imported goods passed. And by July 31st, the Congress had passed and the Congress had signed an act to regulate the collection of the duties imposed on the goods, wares, and merchandises imported into the United States. This act authorized the creation of a relatively small bureaucracy. Ports of entry and delivery were established, and revenue officers were authorized. Thus, our federal customs system, patterned after that which had been practiced in the state, was born. On August 3rd, the president, who clearly had been working on his list of nominations for the offices before the act passed Congress for his signature, conveyed his list of nominees to the Senate. This is the point where Benjamin Fishbourne enters the story. He's the president's nominee for naval officer at the port of Savannah, Georgia. Like most Americans, Fishbourne, who held this position under the state government, had assumed ahead of time that George Washington would be elected president. Thus, in September 1788, he had made an early appeal to Washington for the nomination to this position, before it was even established. Though this letter hasn't been located, Washington's December 23, 1788 response recognizes Fishbourne's distinguished career in the Revolutionary War, including 4 years as the aide-de-camp to General Anthony Wayne. Without making any commitment to nominate Fishbourne, Washington was always very non-committal, and that was wise on his part. In May of 1789, Wayne himself wrote to Washington requesting that Fishbourne be continued in his Savannah position. And in hindsight, Wayne's words might have been a warning to Washington of problems to come. Wayne stated that Fishbourne replaced Reuben Wilkinson, who was suspended for malpractice, but that Wilkinson planned to appear at the seat of government to seek the appointment and would very probably be recommended by a Mr. Gunn, who now holds a seat in the Senate through the intrigues of Mr. Wilkinson. We haven't actually found any evidence that Wilkinson appeared in New York City during the first Congress. Nevertheless, James Gunn of Georgia is the other individual whose name will always be linked with Fishbourne's and the origins of senatorial courtesy. Before continuing this story, I want to add a little relevant procedural background that went on before the Senate considered this nomination. First, the Senate at this time held both its legislative and executive sessions in secret. The bare-bones legislative journal was printed at the end of each session. but the journal where executive business was recorded remained secret for decades after the end of this Congress. That journal tells us that on June 18th, before considering the nomination of William Short to replace Thomas Jefferson as U.S. Minister at the Court of France, the Senate had established a rule that the consent of the Senate to the President's nomination of officers be given by ballot, which means it would be public. Immediately after the nominations for revenue officers were received on August 3rd, some senator made a motion to reconsider this rule, which the Senate disagreed to. A motion to wait on the President of the United States and confer with him on the mode of communication proper to be pursued between him and the Senate on the formation of treaties and making appointments was then introduced and postponed to August 4. Then another motion to dispense with balloting upon the present occasion and to consider the nominations before the Senate via voice vote. That failed. I admit that I hadn't thought too much about these motions and attempts to modify the rules until I began piecing the evidence together for the Fishbourne story. And it dawned on me that these motions almost certainly were attempts by Senator Gunn to conceal the action that he intended to take. Following these motions on rules, the Senate agreed to proceed by ballot, a caveat being assented to that it should not be considered as a precedent. During the balloting on August 3rd and 4th, all the President's nominees were considered and approved except for those of Georgia, which were postponed. On August 5th, the Senate approved the Georgia officers except Fishbourne, whose nomination was rejected. Senate Secretary Samuel A. Otis was directed to lay a certified copy of the proceedings, which would not have included a record of the votes, before the President of the United States. None of the official records reveal either the reason for Fishbourne's rejection or exactly what happened next. They do tell us that following the Fishbourne vote, a motion that it is the opinion of the Senate that their advice and consent to the appointment of officers should be given in the presence of the President was postponed until the next day. On August 6th, the resolution proposed on August 3rd to appoint a committee to confer with the President on the subject of executive communications was agreed to. And Senators Ralph Izard of South Carolina, Rufus King of New York, and Charles Carroll of Maryland were appointed. And the Senate Executive Journal for August 7th prints a letter from the President in which he nominates Lachlan McIntosh as the Savannah Naval Officer. He then appeals to the Senate to consult him in cases when the propriety of the nomination appears questionable to them, so he can provide the information that caused him to make the nomination. Washington concludes by defending his nomination of Fishbourne. He relates Fishbourne's military service, calling his behavior at the Battle of Stony Point active and brave, and discusses all the positions of Georgia government service to which Fishbourne had been selected. In his concluding sentence, Washington used and underlined the word confidence 4 times in stressing the good opinion that militia officers, Georgia, Freeman, and the Georgia Assembly and its councils must have had a Fishbourne to appoint, if they had appointed him to several positions of trust. An August 10th motion to commit this message was postponed until after the Committee on Executive Communications reported, and Fishbourne's name doesn't appear again in the official records. So you have to turn to the unofficial records to flesh out the story. Historians who study the First Congress rely upon Senator Maclay's diary for both insider information about the Senate and insights into the actions of this formative body. As the editors of Maclay's diary, which makes up most of Volume 9 of the documentary history of the First Federal Congress, I have to tell you that Senator Byrd can actually recite from Maclay's diary. He's memorized a good part of it. which was very exciting to hear him do that for us at a party one time. The editors of the diary have called Maclay's diary caustic, sometimes witty, and generally accurate, self-analytical diary that stands behind James Madison's notes on the Federal Convention as the most important journal in American political history. We count on Maclay to reveal much that went on behind the closed doors of the Senate. At the same time, we must be constantly wary of his biases, particularly when he becomes more and more disillusioned with the Federalists' agendas in the second and third sessions. Unfortunately for us, Maclay was on sick leave at or traveled to and from his home north of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, from July 20th through August 15th. And thus he wasn't present to provide us with a first-hand account of what happened on the day that Fishbourne's nomination was rejected. Nevertheless, he does report on an August 16th conversation with Senator Izard, where Izard related that the president showed great want of temper when one of his nominations was rejected. And that's kind of the first clue that Washington actually went to the Senate. Izard, who chaired the Committee on Executive Communications, also reported to Maclay that the president told the committee that he had consulted members of the House on the subject of nominations, but he had not acted so with the senators, as they would have the opportunity of giving their advice and consent afterwards. It seemed clear from both what Izard reported to Maclay and the letter that he sent the Senate that the president thought the word advice implied a dialogue with the Senate when doing executive business, and that's really not a bad interpretation, I think. While Maclay's report on the conversation with Izard is the only contemporary evidence that we have that Washington reacted with anger to Fishbourne's rejection, fortunately we have located a later and more revealing account of the incident in an unsigned letter of March 12, 1818, to Joseph Gales Jr. and William Seaton, who were the publishers of the National Intelligencer. Benjamin Lincoln Lear, the son of Washington's longtime personal secretary Tobias Lear, related what we believe to be his father's version of what happened when the president learned of the vote on Fishbourne. Lear was apparently trying to set the record straight after Gales and Seaton published a different version of the story, which we haven't located. Though Lear's letter states that he believed that it was the nomination for collector of the port of Charleston that was rejected, it's clear that he's discussing the Fishbourne incident. Lear reports that as soon as Washington learned of the Senate's August 5th action, he immediately repaired to the Senate chambers and entered to the astonishment of everyone. Vice President Adams gave up his chair for the president, and who sat and then said that he had come to ask the Senate's reasons for rejecting Fishbourne. Lear states that after many minutes of embarrassing silence, General Gunn rose and said that since he had been the person who had first objected to the nomination, and he had probably been the cause of his rejection, it was perhaps his office to speak on this occasion. That his personal respect for the character of General Washington was such that he would inform him of his grounds for recommending this rejection, and he did so, but that he would have it distinctly understood to be the sense of the Senate that no explanation of their motives or proceedings was ever due or would ever be given to any president of the United States. Lear also reports that he was told that Washington returned from the Senate chamber and expressed great regret for having gone there. Though we don't have any documentary evidence for exactly why Gunn vetoed Fishbourne's nomination, it could have been because Fishbourne got the job that Gunn's friend had, but there's also some other background. Gunn and Fishbourne had been fellow officers during the Revolutionary War. Fishbourne had attempted to deliver Gunn's challenge to a duel to Nathaniel Greene in 1785. Greene had declined this challenge, An undated letter from Fishbourne to an unknown recipient describes an affair of honor between himself and Gunn. And according to this letter, this duel was stopped by the interference of the seconds. So clearly there was some bad blood between the two men, though they probably had been friends at one time. One also ends up with a picture from these descriptions of Gunn as a man with a rather volatile personality. So the first nearly contemporary indication we have found of Senator Gunn's involvement in the rejection, because that Lear letter was quite a bit later, is a letter from New York to Fishbourne, which appeared in the August 27th Georgia Gazette. The author reports that even though Fishbourne was warmly supported by Mr. Robert Morris of Pennsylvania, who is your friend indeed, he was strongly opposed by Gunn and William Few, the other Georgia senator, and states, "They were frequently called upon by your friends in the Senate for their reasons. Gunn urged nothing of consequence but personal invective and abuse. The President, General Washington, was so particular as to give his reasons for the Senate for nominating you, all of which were honorable. Gunn and Few have gained nothing by this maneuver, and I am happy to say that their conduct will have no weight with your friends in depreciating your responsibility or integrity, for you are far better known than either of them on the broad basis of public transactions during the Revolution." Nevertheless, Fishbourne didn't get the job. A few days later, General Wayne wrote to South Carolina Representative Adanus Burke, stating that Gunn had prevented his former aide, meaning Wayne's former aide, from being elected to office with an illiberal, false, and malignant attack upon his character, and asked him to put a certificate signed by the gentleman of distinction at Savannah before the senators. Evidence that Fishbourne actually made his way from Georgia to New York, and that's a long way in those days, to defend his reputation and probably appeal for reconsideration is found in a letter that you can see out in the hallway, actually, from Samuel Otis, the Secretary of the Senate, to Senate President Pro Tem John Langdon, written on September 20th, 1789, after Langdon had returned to New Hampshire, but before the end of the Senate's first session. Otis tells Langdon that he hears that Fishbourne has come to fight himself into character, and continues, "Now I do not think a senator obliged to fight indoors and out too, at least not unless he has double pay, as the Speaker has, or at least more than $6 a day. If, however, our gun should go off, it appears to me it will be a 240, which I suspect is a big gun. So Mr. F might well take care of his head at the same time that he is defending his reputation." By September 25, Washington, having been burned by the Fishbourne incident, directed William Jackson, one of his secretaries, to write to Fishbourne and inform him that when he had nominated him, he was ignorant of the charges existing against him, and that not having, since that time, had any other exhibit of the facts that were alleged in the Senate, whatever those were, we still don't know that, than what is stated in the certificates which have been published by you, he does not consider himself competent to give any opinion on the subject. A letter written by Anthony Wayne to South Carolina Representative Adanus Burke talks about these certificates that are mentioned in Washington's letter, but we have not found the certificates. Despite Fishbourne's appeals and Washington's anger, Gunn prevailed. But the Fishbourne case is only Act 1 of the Senate and the President's struggle to define exactly what the Constitution calls advice and consent and how it should be carried out. Act 2 came later in the Senate's reaction to Washington's first attempt to consult the Senate on treaty negotiations. So let's return to the August 6th Senate resolution appointing a committee to meet with the President on the mode of communication proper to be pursued between him and the Senate on executive business. That was passed after the President arrived in the Senate on the Fishbourne issue. The scheduled meeting between Washington and the committee occurred on August 8th, and the President's notes on what he told the senators have survived. Not surprisingly, they make clear that the Fishbourne incident had convinced Washington that presidential attendance in the Senate's consideration of nomination would be unwise. He comes down on the side of written communications. It would not be a pleasing thing, I conceive, for the President, on the one hand, to be present and hear the propriety of his nominations questioned, nor for the Senate, on the other hand, to be under the smallest restraint by his presence from the fullest and freest inquiry into the character of the person nominated. Washington's final words on this issue provide a pithy summary. For, as the President has a right to nominate without giving reason, so has the Senate a right to dissent without giving theirs. On the issue of consultation on treaties, the President expects his clear opinion that oral communications seem indispensably necessary in matters concerning treaties and the appointment of ministers to foreign offices. He believed that they would probably require much discussion, and having this discussion through written messages would be both tedious and unsatisfactory. The notes also state that questions about the position of the Vice President as the presiding officer of the Senate and whether or not he should give up his chair and express the concern that the President of the United States should be placed in an awkward position. Protocol seemed to be paramount in Washington's mind. As was his habit during the early part of the First Congress, Washington also consulted James Madison, providing him with a summary of his thoughts on the communications issue and seeking Madison's advice. We believe that Madison probably responded in person since no written answer has been located. The committee's August 20th report recommended a flexible protocol for Senate executive communications and also expressed the opinion of both the President and the Senate that the proper manner of carrying out the constitutionally directed practice of advice and consent might be changed by experience. In particular, it made provision for consultation either in the Senate chamber or at the President's residence, but it also anticipated that a special room might be provided for this purpose in any building constructed to house the Congress. The committee left the method of communication open to be determined in a case-by-case basis, recommending that the Senate accommodate their rules to the uncertainty of the particular mode and place. Somewhat surprisingly, the report agreed to by the Senate did describe the procedures for presidential attendance at the consideration of nominations, even after the experience with the Fishbourne nomination. The concluding paragraph brings to mind earlier motions to avoid a ballot on executive issues, that all questions shall be put by the President of the Senate either in the presence or absence of the President of the United States, and the senators shall signify their assent or dissent by answering viva voce, aye or no. The first test of the agreed-upon protocol for Senate presidential communications on a treaty came 2 days later when the Senate chamber, when Senator Henry Knox and the President came, or Secretary of War Henry Knox and the President came to the Senate chamber to report on the situation with the Southern Indians, the Cherokees, Chickasaws, Choctaws, and Creeks. The report posed a series of complex questions for the Senate to answer relating to how to deal with these Indian nations and sought specific instructions on how the commissioners sent to treat with each of the four nations should negotiate, what conditions should be set, and how much money should be appropriated for the process. It being August, the windows of the chamber were open, and Senator McClay reports that the noise from the carriages outside was so loud that he could tell it was something about the Indians, but could not master one sentence of it. When Washington was through reading, Senator Morris rose and asked that the president's message, this is a fairly long message too, be read again because he'd been unable to hear. This second reading was barely completed when John Adams, presiding over the Senate, as he did every day of this Congress, started to call for a vote on the first question that had been posed. This action was met with silence. Maclay reports that Morris whispered, "We'll see who breaks the silence first." Eventually, Maclay stood to state that what had been read appears to have for its basis sundry treaties and public transactions between the Southern Indians and the United States and the states of Georgia, North, and South Carolina. Since the business was new to the Senate and important, the Senate needed to be better informed. Maclay called for a reading of all the treaties and other documents mentioned in the statement by the President. He reports that, "I cast my eye on the President of the United States. I saw he wore an aspect of stern displeasure." Eventually, Morris, seconded by Gunn, there's Gunn again, moved to commit the matter. Though there were objections raised by some senators, including Pierce Butler of South Carolina, who contended that the Senate was acting as an executive council and such councils didn't have committees, Maclay reports that he made a statement supporting the commitment and no time could be lost because the committee should report by Monday. What Maclay reported as happening next is worth quoting. "As I sat down, the President of the United States started up in a violent fret. 'This defeats every purpose of my coming here,' were the first words that he said. He then went on that he had brought his Secretary at War with him to give every necessary information, that the Secretary knew all about the business. The President contended that he didn't object to the postponing, but he couldn't understand the move for commitment and complained that this would cause an unnecessary delay. Apparently these commissioners were already packed and ready to leave New York City to head south. He then stated that he would return at 10 a.m. on Monday the 24th, and he withdrew. Maclay then editorializes, as he's wont to do, that the withdrawal was made with a discontented air, and had it been any other man than the man who I wish to regard as the first character in the world, I would have said with sullen dignity. He concludes that the President wishes to tread on the necks of the Senate. Despite the fact that protocol had supposedly been established for executive business, obviously this first attempt at consultation with the Senate did not go very smoothly. Questions and requests for more information from the senators, as well as their opposition to immediately responding to the questions Washington posed, irritated him greatly. Of course, think about it, he's George Washington. He was used to giving orders, both to officers in the Continental Army and those who worked on his plantation. So this incident with the Senate brought back his memories, I believe, of the frustration he had with dealing with the Continental Congress when he was in charge of the Continental Army. But it was a more controlled and compromising George Washington who returned to the Senate on August 24th to resume work on the questions relating to the negotiations with the Southern Indians. The Senate passed through its consideration of the issues with the President and Knox providing additional information and responding to their questions. Nevertheless, Maclay could not resist questioning a provision by which the federal government would guarantee a promised payment if the state of Georgia failed to make the payment. His fellow senators were silent on this issue, and the exchange with the President on the Southern Indians ended with the agreement to allow up to $20,000 to be spent on negotiating with the Creeks. When he returned to his boarding house that evening, Maclay found that he had an invitation to dine with the President. Even this ever suspicious senator saw himself as honored by this invitation. That's proof positive that George Washington was a good politician. I've provided pieces of Maclay's discussion of Washington's dealing with the Senate here, but I hope you've heard enough to recognize that he's both perceptive and opinionated. Though he supported the ratification of the Constitution, we believe he is one of the very first Federalists to shift over to a more Jeffersonian Republican viewpoint. He certainly found himself in opposition to much of the Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton's agenda as it was revealed. But it is only through his diary and the unofficial documents that we're able to learn the inside story of what happened behind the closed doors of the Senate. If we had additional diaries and other resources, a fuller and perhaps conflicting story that presented Washington's dealing with the Senate in a more favorable light might have emerged. The documents provide evidence, but it's up to the historians to gather all the evidence and draw their conclusions. So what can we learn from the stories of these early encounters between the Senate and the President on executive business? Clearly, they illustrate that the constitutional requirement for advice and consent on nominations and treaties left a lot to be worked out and defined in terms of process and protocol. Both the President and the Senate were on new and untested ground, and things did not go smoothly at the beginning. As differing perceptions of how the process should work and what was meant by advice and consent were manifested, a protocol that usually did not include presidential appearances in the Senate evolved. This defining and interpreting of our Constitution is a constant process, and it's at the very heart of what has made our government work as well as it has for 225 years. Thank you.